He was impossible to miss. Towering well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered, his face permanently scarred from old wounds, Ernst Kaltenbrunner did not look like a man who belonged in the shadows. Yet by 1943, he stood at the very heart of one of the darkest machines ever created, the security empire of the Third Reich. When Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated and removed from the chessboard of Nazi power, many assumed Heinrich Himmler would personally tighten his grip on the Reich's vast intelligence and police network. Instead, something far more dangerous happened. Control passed to a man few outside inner Nazi circles truly understood. At Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner would later insist he knew almost nothing. He claimed he was merely a legal functionary, a bureaucrat who signed papers without influence, a towering figure with no real authority. But the documents told a different story. Orders, directives, and internal correspondence painted a portrait not of a passive administrator, but of a man deeply embedded in the system of terror. A man who survived long enough to rise when others fell. So how did an Austrian lawyer from a quiet northern town become the overseer of the Reich's most feared security apparatus? Ernst Kaltenbrunner was born on October 4, 1903, in Riedem in Kreis, a provincial town in northern Austria. His early life gave no obvious indication of the role he would later play. He attended local schools and went on to study law at the University of Graz, graduating in the late 1920s. By profession, he was trained to interpret laws, not to dismantle them. But the political climate of Austria during those years was volatile, violent, and radicalizing. Extremist movements clashed openly in the streets, and nationalist ideology gained momentum among those who believed Germany's destiny extended beyond its borders. Kaltenbrunner was drawn to this world early. In the early 1930s, he joined the Austrian Nazi movement at a time when doing so carried real personal risk. The Nazi Party was illegal in Austria. Its members operated underground under constant threat of arrest. Meetings were secret, communications coded, and loyalty tested under pressure. In 1931, Kaltenbrunner joined the SS, becoming part of a small but expanding Austrian network connected to Heinrich Himmler's growing organization in Germany. What set Kaltenbrunner apart was not charisma or ideology alone. It was his willingness to take risks, enforce discipline, and organize fragmented groups into functional units. He was known as aggressive, physically imposing, and unafraid of confrontation. Arrests followed. Austrian authorities cracked down repeatedly on Nazi activity, and Kaltenbrunner found himself detained more than once. Each arrest only hardened his reputation. By the mid-1930s, he had established close connections with key Austrian Nazi figures and served in leadership roles within the underground movement. His loyalty to the cause, proven under pressure, made him valuable. When Austria was annexed by Germany in 1938, Kaltenbrunner's fortunes changed overnight. Men who had once operated in secrecy were now elevated into official power. His rise accelerated rapidly. On January 30, 1943, Ernst Kaltenbrunner arrived in Berlin to assume control of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA. It was an institution forged by two towering figures, Reinhard Heydrich, who had built it into a centralized empire of terror, and Heinrich Himmler, who oversaw it from above. The RSHA combined the Gestapo, criminal police, and intelligence services into a single organization responsible for domestic surveillance, foreign espionage, political repression, and coordination with the concentration camp system. It was enormous, and it was already filled with powerful men. Heinrich Müller controlled the Gestapo. Walter Schellenberg directed foreign intelligence. Both had deep institutional knowledge and established networks. Kaltenbrunner did not create the system, he inherited it. His role was not architectural, but supervisory. He issued directives, enforced policy, and ensured the machinery kept running as Germany's military situation worsened. His relationship with Himmler was central to his authority. Himmler valued subordinates who followed orders precisely and avoided internal power struggles. Kaltenbrunner fit this profile. Surviving correspondence shows that Himmler increasingly delegated internal security matters to him. Official communications passed through Kaltenbrunner's office. Political directives, arrest protocols, and intelligence coordination bore his approval. Despite later claims that he merely followed instructions, Kaltenbrunner's influence expanded. Some sources from the final months of the war suggest Himmler himself feared internal surveillance overseen by Kaltenbrunner. And if this story already feels unsettling, pause here for a moment. This video takes time, research, and effort to make. If you want more deep dives into hidden power figures and the machinery behind history's darkest regimes, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what story we should uncover next. Now, back to the shadows. Within the RSHA, power relationships shifted as the war dragged on. Heinrich Müller had once enjoyed near-total operational autonomy, but by 1944, the balance began to change. Kaltenbrunner chaired meetings, approved major initiatives, and shaped the internal security agenda. Walter Schellenberg, though outwardly independent, increasingly required authorization for key intelligence operations. Following the failed July 20th plot against Hitler, security measures across the Reich intensified dramatically. Kaltenbrunner played a central role in coordinating the response. Arrests, interrogations, and investigations were funneled through RSHA channels. The system tightened as paranoia spread through the collapsing regime. By early 1945, Kaltenbrunner was one of the most powerful men still operating in Berlin. As Allied forces closed in, ministries fractured, communications faltered, and authority became increasingly concentrated in those who could still enforce control. Kaltenbrunner continued issuing orders even as the state around him disintegrated. He traveled between Berlin, Munich, Salzburg, and eventually into the Alpine regions, where fantasies of a final defensive stronghold persisted among Nazi leadership. But survival, not strategy, was now the priority. By the time Germany collapsed in May 1945, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was no longer directing an empire of security. He was hiding, and the reckoning was just beginning. By the beginning of 1945, the Reich Main Security Office still existed on paper, but in reality it was bleeding from every seam. Front lines were collapsing, cities were burning, rail lines were severed, communications intercepted, and entire administrative chains simply stopped functioning. Yet inside this chaos, Ernst Kaltenbrunner continued to behave as if authority itself could hold the state together. Orders were still issued, directives still stamped, reports still demanded. The machinery of repression did not stop simply because the war was lost. Kaltenbrunner's position had quietly transformed. No longer merely an administrator, he had become a gatekeeper, one of the last men capable of coordinating what remained of internal security. Heinrich Himmler, increasingly distracted by collapsing fronts and his own attempts at secret negotiations, leaned more heavily on him. Power consolidated not because it was planned, but because there were fewer hands left to hold it. Inside the RSHA, fear replaced structure. Officials began destroying files or selectively preserving them. Others attempted to reposition themselves, crafting narratives they hoped would protect them later. Kaltenbrunner oversaw evacuations of personnel and archives, attempting to preserve fragments of control even as Berlin became indefensible. Meetings were shorter, decisions more desperate. The illusion of centralized authority was maintained as long as possible, because once it vanished, survival became individual. For the Allies, Kaltenbrunner's name rose rapidly on priority lists. He was not as publicly known as other figures, but Intelligence assessments identified him as one of the most critical remaining nodes of the Nazi security apparatus. His signature appeared on orders related to arrests, classifications of prisoners, and coordination between intelligence and police units. He was not a symbolic figure. He was operational. As Soviet forces advanced toward Berlin, Kaltenbrunner divided his time between the capital and southern Germany. Records show meetings held on Prinz Albrechtstrasse in early March 1945, even as artillery drew closer. But soon, Berlin was no longer viable. Like many senior figures, he turned south, toward Bavaria and Austria, toward mountains that promised concealment rather than victory. The idea of an Alpine redoubt circulated widely in the final months of the war. It was a fantasy, a belief that remnants of the regime could regroup in the mountains and resist indefinitely. While historians largely dismiss it as unrealistic, the belief itself shaped behavior. Kaltenbrunner moved accordingly. By April 1945, he reached Alto See, a remote region in the Austrian Alps. From there, declassified intelligence reports describe a pattern of movement between mountain lodges, safe houses, and temporary shelters. Kaltenbrunner was no longer commanding an empire. He was attempting to remain relevant. Messages continued to flow outward, instructions still issued to what fragments of the RSHA remained intact. Whether these orders were followed is unclear. What is clear is that he still saw himself as a man with leverage. Some sources suggest he attempted to position himself as a potential negotiator, someone capable of dealing with Allied or even Soviet forces. Historians debate how serious these efforts were. What remains undeniable is that Kaltenbrunner did not surrender when Germany collapsed on May 8, 1945. He hid. 4 days later, on May 12th, American Counterintelligence Corps agents closed in on the Alto See region. Acting on local information and intercepted communications, they searched a series of Alpine cabins. Inside one of them, they found a group of SS officers and medical staff. Among them was a towering man who claimed to be a doctor. He provided a false name and attempted to blend into the group. For a brief moment, the deception held, but it did not last long. As the detainees were transported back to town, 2 women identified him. One was his longtime companion. The other was a relative by marriage. They recognized him instantly. At that moment, Ernst Kaltenbrunner admitted his identity. He was placed under arrest immediately and transferred to an interrogation center. The man who once oversaw vast intelligence networks was now reduced to a prisoner, stripped of authority, protected only by the hope that ambiguity might save him. It would not. When Kaltenbrunner arrived in Nuremberg later in 1945, he stood out instantly. At over 6.5 feet tall, visibly weakened from months in hiding, and suffering from serious health issues, he was nevertheless the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial. Medical examinations recorded high blood pressure and chronic pain, but mentally he was alert, focused, and prepared. From the first interrogation, his strategy was clear. He would deny operational responsibility. Kaltenbrunner presented himself as a legal administrator with limited authority. He claimed that real power within the RSHA belonged to others, particularly Heinrich Müller. He insisted he did not control concentration camps, did not oversee interrogations, and did not issue key orders related to persecution or murder. According to his testimony, he was a man buried under paperwork, not a commander shaping outcomes. The prosecution was ready for this defense. They produced RSHA documents bearing his signature or initials, orders concerning arrests, prisoner classifications, and coordination between intelligence and police divisions, internal correspondence placing him at the center of security discussions. Witnesses followed, former RSHA officers who described meetings chaired by Kaltenbrunner where decisions were made. Walter Schellenberg testified that Kaltenbrunner was deeply involved in political security matters during the later stages of the war. Archive officials confirmed receiving instructions directly from his office. While debates continued about how much autonomy Müller retained, the pattern was unmistakable. Kaltenbrunner exercised substantial administrative power. In January 1946, a report published by the New York Times added another dimension. It described testimony placing Kaltenbrunner at locations where killings occurred. His defense argued he was present only as an observer, fulfilling administrative duties. Prosecutors countered that presence itself implied direct involvement in security operations. Kaltenbrunner claimed he had attempted to moderate extreme actions ordered by Himmler. These statements were tested against documents and intercepted communications. The evidence showed no meaningful opposition to the system he led. When confronted with documents signed by him, he argued that he had not read them carefully, or that others had signed on his behalf. Investigators pointed out handwritten annotations matching his script. His testimony grew increasingly contradictory. The deeper the documentary trail went, the harder it became to sustain the image of a powerless administrator. The man who once coordinated the Reich's internal security could not convincingly explain why his authority appeared so expansive on paper, yet so limited in his own account. The illusion of distance collapsed, and judgment was approaching. As the Nuremberg Trials moved deeper into their most complex phase, Ernst Kaltenbrunner's carefully constructed defense began to unravel. From the outside, his strategy seemed logical. He did not deny that crimes had occurred. He did not even deny that the RSHA had played a central role in repression, surveillance, and terror. Instead, he attempted something far more subtle: separation. Separation of office from action. Separation of signature from intent. Separation of authority from responsibility. In theory, it was a defense built on bureaucracy. Kaltenbrunner portrayed the RSHA as a vast, compartmentalized structure in which real operational control rested with subordinates. He described himself as a coordinator, a conduit, a legal overseer drowning in paperwork while others carried out crimes beyond his reach. Again and again, he returned to the same claim: "I did not know," or "I was not informed," or "I had no direct command." The prosecution understood the danger of this argument. If accepted, it would redefine guilt in modern systems of power. It would suggest that those who design, manage, and authorize structures of violence could escape responsibility simply by avoiding physical proximity to crimes. Nuremberg was not only judging individuals, it was establishing a precedent. And so the prosecution dismantled the defense piece by piece. They began with documents. Thousands of pages from RSHA archives were introduced into evidence. Orders bearing Kaltenbrunner's signature, directives initialed in his hand, communications sent from his office to regional commanders. These were not ceremonial approvals. They concerned arrests, deportations, intelligence coordination, and responses to resistance activity. They revealed a man deeply involved in the functioning of the security state. When confronted with these documents, Kaltenbrunner shifted tactics. He claimed that signatures did not imply authorship, that he signed under pressure, that documents passed across his desk in such volume that careful review was impossible, that subordinates prepared texts, and he merely formalized them. But this explanation collided with testimony from former RSHA officials, who described a far more engaged superior. Witnesses spoke of meetings chaired by Kaltenbrunner, where policy was discussed and decisions were finalized. They described him as forceful, authoritative, and fully aware of the consequences of security measures. Some testified that his approval was required before sensitive operations could proceed. The courtroom atmosphere changed. What had begun as a technical debate about administrative roles increasingly became a moral confrontation. The judges pressed Kaltenbrunner on inconsistencies. Prosecutors highlighted contradictions between his testimony and written records. Each attempt to minimize his role seemed to generate more evidence of his influence. At one point, the defense attempted to portray Kaltenbrunner as a restraining force, a man who tried to limit excesses within the system. He claimed to have opposed certain executions and argued that he sought to maintain legal order even as the regime collapsed. The documents told a different story. There was no record of meaningful resistance, no documented attempt to halt mass arrests, no evidence of intervention on behalf of victims. Instead, the files showed continuity. The RSHA functioning under his leadership much as it had before, adapting to wartime pressures but never abandoning its purpose. Midway through the proceedings, the human dimension of the trial became unavoidable. Survivors testified. Former prisoners described interrogations, deportations, and disappearances. While Kaltenbrunner was rarely accused of personally committing acts of violence, his name appeared again and again as the authority behind the system that enabled them. The courtroom was forced to confront a central question. Could someone who designed and maintained a machinery of terror be innocent simply because he did not pull the trigger? The prosecution's answer was unequivocal. No. They argued that Kaltenbrunner's power was not accidental, that his rise reflected trust from Himmler and integration into the highest levels of the regime, that he benefited from the authority of his office and exercised it willingly. The RSHA did not function despite him. It functioned through him. At this stage, public interest in the trial intensified. Newspapers across Europe and the United States reported daily developments. Observers noted Kaltenbrunner's physical presence, towering, rigid, often expressionless, and contrasted it with the evasiveness of his answers. His health deteriorated, but his composure remained. He listened carefully. He responded precisely. He never admitted moral guilt. Quick pause. If you're finding this deep dive into history valuable, remember that this kind of content survives only because of your support. Subscribing, liking, and commenting helps keep these stories alive and allows us to continue exploring the truth behind power and accountability. Now, back to the trial. As closing arguments approached, the defense faced an impossible task. They could not deny the crimes. They could not erase the documents. They could not silence the witnesses. Instead, they attempted to reframe Kaltenbrunner as a functionary trapped within a system larger than himself. A cog rather than a driver. The judges were unconvinced. They had seen this argument before. Many defendants claimed obedience, limitation, or ignorance. What distinguished Kaltenbrunner was his rank. As chief of the RSHA, he was not an instrument. He was a node of command. His authority connected intelligence, police, and enforcement into a single apparatus. Without figures like him, the system could not operate. In private deliberations, the tribunal examined not only what Kaltenbrunner claimed to have done, but what his position required. Leadership, they concluded, carried responsibility whether acknowledged or not. Power implied knowledge. Authority implied accountability. On October 1st, 1946, the verdict was delivered. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The judgment cited his leadership of the RSHA and his role in directing the security police and intelligence services. It rejected his claim of limited authority and emphasized the documentary evidence demonstrating his involvement. The sentence was death. Kaltenbrunner listened without visible reaction. 12 days later, in the early hours of October 16, 1946, He was executed at Nuremberg prison. His body, along with those of other convicted leaders, was cremated. The ashes were scattered into the Isar River to prevent any grave from becoming a site of pilgrimage. The man who once controlled the Reich's internal security vanished without a marker. But the implications of his trial did not. Kaltenbrunner's conviction established a critical precedent. It affirmed that those who design, administer, and sustain systems of mass repression cannot hide behind distance or delegation. It defined responsibility not by physical action alone, but by authority and intent. His fall marked more than the end of a career. It marked the collapse of an argument. The idea that power without visible blood could escape judgment. And in the final block, we will examine what Kaltenbrunner's case revealed about modern bureaucratic evil and why his legacy still matters today. The execution of Ernst Kaltenbrunner did not end the story of the Reich Main Security Office. It ended only the life of the man who stood at its apex during the final, most destructive phase of the Nazi regime. What followed was something far more enduring, a reckoning with how modern systems of power commit crimes without requiring every participant to wield a weapon. In the months after the Nuremberg verdicts, historians, legal scholars, and intelligence professionals began to study Kaltenbrunner's case closely. Unlike figures who were remembered for fiery speeches or battlefield commands, he represented a quieter form of authority. His power came from files, signatures, meetings, and organizational charts. He was not the face of terror, he was its infrastructure. This distinction mattered. The 20th century had revealed a new kind of criminality. Crimes committed not by isolated acts of cruelty, but by coordinated institutions. Kaltenbrunner's RSHA embodied this reality. It merged intelligence, policing, surveillance, and repression into a single administrative machine. Each department performed its function, each official followed procedures, and together they produced mass suffering on an unprecedented scale. The tribunal's rejection of Kaltenbrunner's defense reshaped how responsibility was defined. The judges concluded that leadership within such a system was not neutral. To manage an organization designed for repression was itself an act of participation. The idea that moral guilt required physical proximity to violence was explicitly rejected. What mattered was knowledge, authority, and the willingness to continue. This principle would echo far beyond Nuremberg. In later decades, courts and commissions investigating crimes and other conflicts would return to the Kaltenbrunner precedent. His case demonstrated that following orders or managing bureaucracy could not erase accountability. It established that modern evil often wears a suit, not a uniform, and that paperwork can be as lethal as bullets. Historians also noted something else. Kaltenbrunner was not an ideological visionary. He did not invent doctrines. He did not reshape the regime's goals. Instead, he ensured continuity. When Heydrich was assassinated, the system did not collapse. Under Kaltenbrunner, it adapted. It became more rigid, more defensive, more desperate, but it continued. This adaptability was the true danger. The RSHA survived leadership changes because it was built to function independently of individual morality. Kaltenbrunner's greatest contribution to the system was not innovation, but maintenance. He kept the machinery running as Germany burned around it. In doing so, he prolonged suffering even as defeat became inevitable. His relationship with Himmler offers further insight. Himmler valued loyalty and obedience, but he also feared internal threats. In the final months of the war, he increasingly relied on Kaltenbrunner to manage internal security while he pursued political maneuvering of his own. This delegation concentrated enormous power in Kaltenbrunner's hands. Yet when the regime collapsed, that same proximity to authority became his undoing. At Nuremberg, Kaltenbrunner attempted to portray himself as abandoned by his superiors. But the evidence showed something more troubling. He was trusted precisely because he could be relied upon to enforce policy without hesitation. His downfall was not the result of betrayal. It was the consequence of alignment. After the war, efforts were made to erase physical traces of men like him. There would be no grave, no monument, no official memorial. The scattering of ashes into the Isar River symbolized an attempt to deny the defeated regime any focal point for nostalgia or myth-making. But history does not disappear so easily. Kaltenbrunner's name remains in archives, transcripts, and legal textbooks. His trial is studied not because of who he was as an individual, but because of what he represented. He was proof that immense harm can be caused by people who never see themselves as villains, only as professionals doing their job. This realization forced societies to ask uncomfortable questions. How many crimes depend on people who value efficiency over ethics? How many systems reward obedience while discouraging conscience? How often does responsibility dissolve into organizational charts until no one feels accountable? The Nuremberg judges understood that answering these questions was essential for the future. Their verdict was not merely punitive, it was declarative. It stated that authority carries moral weight, that leadership cannot be morally neutral, that choosing to remain in power within a criminal system is itself a choice, and choices have consequences. In this sense, Kaltenbrunner's legacy extends far beyond the Second World War. His case warns against the normalization of cruelty through procedure. It exposes the danger of institutions that separate action from accountability, and it reminds us that the most destructive figures are often those who appear calm, rational, and indispensable. In the end, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was not remembered for charisma, ideology, or battlefield genius. He was remembered for administration, and that is precisely why his story matters, because history's greatest atrocities are rarely carried out by monsters alone. They are sustained by managers, lawyers, coordinators, and officials who convince themselves that responsibility lies elsewhere. Nuremberg proved that it does not. Thank you for watching. If you want to explore the inner workings of power, obedience, and accountability further, check out our videos on Heinrich Müller and Walter Schellenberg, figures who reveal the same system from different angles. Like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment. Which part of this story shocked you the most? We'll see you in the next one.